glad to be with you today. We're going to start off today talking about artificial intelligence and big data and cyber threats, and I'm going to freak you out for about half an hour. And then we're going to move on to the panel, but let's start with freaking you out this morning. So I study artificial intelligence and social media and basically do all kinds of creepy things with the data that you put online. You've probably heard some of this talked about in the media, but it's way worse than you think it is, so that's what we're going to start with today. So one of the things that we started off doing about 10 years ago was trying to discover people's personal attributes by analyzing their data. So in my lab, we built an algorithm that would look at your public Facebook data, and it could tell your personality traits. So how many of you have done like a Myers-Briggs? That's like the INTJ kind of thing. Are there any introverts in the room? It's like me and two other people. I promise not to talk to you when we're done. So it turned out that worked really well. And it was one of the first studies in this space of finding out stuff that people weren't explicitly saying by using artificial intelligence in their data. And that really cracked open a space that has become huge. One of my favorite examples comes from Target. So this story, I think, was in the New York Times in about 2012. So in computer science land, that's an old example. But it paints a picture of the power of what we can do with a huge amount of data that people leave behind. So this story opens with this amazing anecdote of this dad in Minnesota who kind of charges into his local Target, and he's got a flyer. He gets the manager over, and the dad is like in a rage. You know, you sent this flyer to my 15-year-old daughter. It has coupons for baby bottles and maternity clothes and diapers. Do you want her to get pregnant? She's only a junior in high school. The manager has no idea what the dad's talking about. Like, Target headquarters sends out the mailers, not the individual stores, but he promises to look into it, and a couple weeks later, the manager calls the dad back just to apologize. And the dad says, you know, I actually owe you an apology because it turns out my 15-year-old is pregnant. Target just found out before she told us. So how does that happen? So Target's not actually using social media data, at least they weren't at the time. But the data that they do have is everything everyone has ever bought at Target. And not just how much of each product sells, but per person. Because if you use a credit or a debit card, even if you use different ones, or if you have a loyalty card, it's very easy to piece those together into a single record so we know they're from you. So Target has this for millions of people. They want to know when a woman is pregnant because when you have a baby is one of the few times that people will change where they shop. So they figure if they can get you to come in while you're pregnant and you see all the stuff they have, then maybe you'll shop there once you actually have your baby. So how do you find out if a woman is early in her pregnancy by looking at her purchase history? Any guesses? Pregnancy test? Pregnancy test is the Family Feud winning answer. That's the most common answer I get when I ask this question, but it's a trick question because it's obviously not that simple. Plenty of us have bought pregnancy tests hoping that they're negative, and in fact, Target doesn't pay a lot of attention to those individual purchases. What they do is they can easily tell when someone's had a baby from their purchase history, right? You see a big spike in like wipes and diapers and all the things you buy for an infant. So you don't need any artificial intelligence for that. Just find those patterns. And then they look at what they were buying 6, 7, 8 months before that. What they found is that it's not any individual purchase, but it's combinations of things that can be really strong indicators. So they interviewed someone who worked in this data group at Target, and he said, at the time, one of the strongest indicators of a woman who is early in her pregnancy is if she bought these 3 things together: an extra bottle of lotion, a handbag that's big enough to double as a diaper bag, but like not an actual diaper bag, just a big handbag, and brightly colored rugs. So like you're in line and the lady has like cocoa butter and a giant purse and a blue rug, and you're like, she's totally pregnant, right? Like, probably not, but the data can tell that. And you know, this is an important example because it doesn't make sense, right? Like maybe the lotion, maybe it has stretched the handbag, but like you're not decorating a nursery when you're 8 weeks pregnant, right? So why the rug? We don't know. And that's critical. Artificial intelligence can tell you the answer. Is this person pregnant or not? But it does not give you insight into why. And that's really critical for as you think about how to use these tools. Another thing is that we don't really understand how they make those decisions internally. It's very statistical, it's not very logical, and so it's hard to even get an explanation. And the final thing here is that since you don't know logically what actions convey what information, it's hard to keep things private because you wouldn't know adding that rug to your cart is going to tell Target that you're pregnant. So if you want to keep your pregnancy private, you don't know what actions to refrain from or engage in. And that's the story that consistently appears as we did work for years and years on inferring personal attributes from this data. Everything we have tried to figure out, we have been able to figure out. Demographics like race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, behavioral things like if you're a drinker or a smoker or a drug user, if your parents divorced before you were 21, what your political leanings are, what your IQ is, all of that, very easy to figure out with these algorithms and the data that's available. And so we got really good at that. And then as a scientist, it becomes not super interesting, right? Because of course, we know how to do it. So what we started to look at, kind of by accident, was how we could predict things you would do in the future. And the first study that kind of inspired this was from Cornell, and they weren't trying to do that. What they wanted to do was look at your list of Facebook friends and pick which one of them was your spouse or your significant other. So that's pretty challenging, right? Is finding one person out of a list of hundreds of people that you're friends with on Facebook. Is anyone here not on Facebook, by the way? You all are. I will get to you in about 10 minutes. They get you every possible way. So yeah, so most of you are on Facebook though. So you have all of these friends, and these researchers restricted themselves to just looking at your friends and which of them were friends with each other, not even names. Just imagine we number your friends like 1 through 200, and then we're like, so friend number 1, they're also connected to your friend number 17, 23, and so on. But basically what we have is a picture of your personal social network. That's the data that they used. So a guess is to pick which person just from that might be your significant other. Could be, well, maybe it's the person you have the most friends in common with. And that's a pretty good guess, but they wanted to do better. So they came up with this great concept called social dispersion. It's a cool name for a pretty straightforward idea, which is, if you think about your social network, whether it's online or offline, you tend to have some pretty distinct groups. And I definitely have this. I do this exercise with my students in class. So I grew up in this small town in northern Illinois. I've got a bunch of high school friends. I come from a big Catholic family, so I have like 50 cousins. They're all connected, but they went to the Catholic high school, so they don't know my public school friends. And then I moved for college and graduate school. I play ice hockey on a men's team, so there's like 20 dudes in the corner who aren't connected to anybody else, which is just fine, right? So I have all these different groups. And they're very disconnected a lot of times because I moved in between. But you will certainly have this even if you stayed in one place. You may have people you go to church with, people you're on a team with, your kids, parents, friends, that kind of thing. So social dispersion says your significant other is probably the person who's connected to the most number of those groups. And that works for me too. So I got married a few years ago. My husband is like 10 years older than me, different profession. He's German. We grew up in different places, went to different schools. We actually don't have a lot of friends in common, but he has friends in every single one of those social groups, right? He's met the cousin at the wedding, the high school friends who came through town, a couple colleagues, a couple hockey guys. So he covers all the different parts of my life. And that's what this concept describes. And it turns out to be really good. It will pick the right person off that big long list about 75% of the time. So that's great. These researchers were like, cool, they analyzed their data, but they're engineers, and after a couple months, they were like, well, maybe we can make some tweaks. So they went back and grabbed some more data. And what they found is that if they had guessed wrong for you in the first place, that you were 50% more likely to have broken up in those 2 months than if they guessed right. So essentially, they can tell you if your relationship is going to last when you're in it and you think everything is going fine. And they didn't mention it, but they could also tell you who a good alternative is to your current partner, right? We don't think it'll work out with this guy, but this one over here might be a good choice. So they weren't intending to do that, but it inspired a lot of us to intentionally go looking for things that we might be able to predict like this. In my lab, we did a study similar to this, trying to predict if people who went into Alcoholics Anonymous would stay sober for 90 days. So 90 days is a kind of good marker for early addiction recovery. And so we went on to Twitter, and we found everyone who announced they were going to their first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. This, of course, takes the anonymous part out of it, so who knows how that has biased our data. That's an important question that we want to ask, but we just kind of went with it, okay. And we filtered out all of the jokes. We read these people's public posts. So these were people who legitimately were like, I'm drinking too much tomorrow, I'm going to my first AA meeting. And then we followed what they tweeted after that to see if they were sober 90 days later. They had to explicitly say. So it could be the next week they were complaining about being hungover at work. We knew they were drinking. It could be a year on, they celebrated their 1 year of sobriety, and so we knew they were also sober at 90 days. So we had explicit answers for everyone. That's what you need to build these algorithms. And then what we did is we collected everything they put on Twitter up until they announced they were going to that first AA meeting. So everything until they decide to get help. And we analyzed that and built an algorithm that would look at that to predict, will they make it 90 days? And our algorithm was right 85% of the time. It can predict with incredible accuracy on the day you decide to go to AA if it's going to work for you or not. Is that good or bad? I always like to think about these things because tons of bad stuff is done with these kinds of tools. The fact that we have not put this tool up online for people to use tells you that I worry about it. I'm sure you can think of ways that that kind of prediction could be misused, especially because when our algorithm is wrong, it tends to be pessimistic. So when it gets it wrong, it tends to say that people who will in fact remain sober will not. So that's not great. At the same time, we built some insight into the tool. So it doesn't just say yes or no, you'll make it 90 days. It kind of tells you why. So maybe you have a social circle that's tweeting about drinking all the time. That's the kind of thing that we know makes it hard in person, so maybe that's a thing to change. We can tell what your coping style is from the way that you write online. And so if that's a big indicator, we could say this is a kind of therapy that could help you. So there's real ways that it could be beneficial, but there's also real risks that come with it. And that's a story that I think emerges out of a lot of this kind of AI that works on people's data. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But of course, all of this only works if I have a bunch of data about you. And of course I do, right? We hear about this all the time, that our data's out there, it's all over the place, but it's way worse than you think, again. So how many of you have had this experience where like your phone is sitting on the table, you're not touching it, and you're like, maybe next time we go on vacation, we could go to Costa Rica. And you don't search for it, you don't write it down, but the next day there's like ads for Costa Rican tourism showing up on like Facebook or blogs. That's because, as you suspect, your microphone is turned on by apps on your phone, it passively listens in, it picks up on keywords, and then it uses that to show you advertisements. Everybody denies that they do this, but a bunch of different apps have been caught doing it, and in fact, there's a new big class action that just got filed last month that's actually going to bring this out. So that's totally a thing that's happening. But the data comes in all kinds of other ways. So for like the 10 of you who said you don't have Facebook profiles, you do. Facebook has admitted this talking to Congress. They maintain what they call a shadow profile for everyone who does not have an actual profile on Facebook. And the way that that works, well, let me ask, do any of you have a flip phone and no friends? Okay, that last one always gets everybody. Okay, so you're all in there. So, so say you and I are friends, you are not on Facebook, but say I have the Facebook app. I don't, for a good reason, but say I have it. I download the Facebook app, it grabs all my contacts. Lots of apps do this when you log in. You're in my contact list because we know each other. And so Facebook now says, okay, well, I don't have a profile for the person with this phone number and this email address, but let's just stick that in a little placeholder. There's this phone number, that's a unique identifier, and your email address and maybe your name, and if I know you well enough, there's maybe a picture of you in there. And everybody you know who downloads the Facebook app and lets it grab their contacts, or maybe Facebook just takes those contacts without permission, they also have you in there with your phone number. And so Facebook gets all of the data that all of them have in the contact lists for you, and now they know who you know. And that's going to surface some of these social circles we were talking about before. Here's people that you are on the PTA with, here's people you go to church with. It finds those groups and it can say, well, if you know 10 people over here and they're all part of this church group, maybe you go to that church. Or maybe these people all went to your high school, maybe you went there too. And they can find other people you know, and it can use the pictures that were in the contact list to run their facial recognition algorithm and find other photos of you that have been posted even though you weren't tagged. So when you do finally give in and sign up for Facebook, it has a fully completed profile just waiting for you to click yes next to everything. Facebook is way creepier than that, though. I'm picking on Facebook here because there's a lot of reporting on it, but they are certainly not the only ones doing this kind of thing. But as one more example of just how all that data out there gets put together in ways that we kind of wouldn't have expected. Facebook has filed a couple patents for their feature called People You May Know. So this is the thing that suggests people that you might want to add as a friend on Facebook. And Facebook loves this feature because it keeps people on Facebook longer, which is the main thing that they want to do. So one of these patents looks at photos. So imagine we're outside in the hall after this session, and one of you takes a picture of me, and I was like, wow, that's a great picture of me. I'm so not photogenic. Could you send that to me? And I post it on my Facebook page. It's literally just me. We don't know each other. I've just posted this photo on my Facebook page. And then say you take a picture of a couple other people and you text it to them, and one of them posts it on their page. So none of us are friends on Facebook in this scenario. You just happen to be a good photographer. Facebook is going to analyze the hidden traces left by the dust and scratches on your camera lens to identify that those two photos were taken by the same camera at the same time, and then recommend that me and the other person who posted your picture become friends. Because if we were in the same place at the same time with our picture taken by the same person, we probably know each other. Another thing that they're doing is using the location tracking on your phone. So if you're next to a person for a long time, that may mean you're having a conversation and you want to be friends. But of course, that's not necessarily true. Before COVID, and hopefully someday soon, we could be packed into a bar at happy hour. We could actually be touching shoulder to shoulder, talking to different groups of people and never even look at each other. So it doesn't mean just because we're standing close, we would want to be friends on Facebook, and Facebook is smart enough to know that. So they use the accelerometer in your phone, which is the thing that can tell like which direction it's tilting or pointing. It can tell if you're facing towards each other or away from each other, or if you're moving together. And so if you're facing towards each other or moving together, then Facebook could suggest you become friends. So like that creepy guy at the bar who won't leave me alone and follows me out, Facebook will very helpfully suggest he add me as a friend on his profile the next day because of that. I have like 2 hours of material to freak you out more, but I have 12 and a half minutes left to talk to you. So I promise you it gets worse, and we can do more of that in the Q&A if you want more Halloween-style freak out in Dataland. But let's talk about this in terms of threats that you might have to deal with, because of course, on the cybersecurity side, there's real threats that emerge here. And that comes simply from the loss of privacy. So the most straightforward, easy way to look at this is something like security questions, right? What's your mother's maiden name? What's the model of your first car? Cybersecurity researchers have specifically looked into how much of that data, how many of those questions can we answer just by looking at people's social media feeds, maybe running a light artificial intelligence on that. And it's the vast majority. So just that reduction of privacy for those simple questions alone is an issue. And of course, when we talk about social engineering attacks, which is a major way that systems get penetrated, this kind of thing also is incredibly powerful. And we've seen it deployed in ways to influence people as well. So you think about things like Cambridge Analytica or all of these psychological manipulations that are done on people. That's taking exactly this technology, including some that I have built and did not authorize to be used this way, to influence people to do what we want. And that absolutely is being used by cyber criminals. So the privacy and personal data aspect of this certainly creates cyber threats. But from your perspective, I think bigger things to think about in addition are the issues that come with the use of this kind of technology in terms of trust and reputation and bias. So let's start with the first two, trust and reputation, because these are clearly intertwined. If you're doing this creepy stuff I've talked about, you can look creepy too. Now, I build this kind of technology because it's used in profoundly useful ways. Amazon uses this to recommend stuff for you to buy. Netflix uses it to recommend shows. The math under the hood is identical to all these examples that I've given you, but it doesn't freak us out because we kind of know how they got our data. Like, of course, Netflix knows what I've watched on Netflix and Amazon knows what I've bought. We know what they're doing with it. It feels like I know why they have this. I know what's happening, so I'm not worried. And it helps me, right? If I weren't getting recommendations, there's stuff I would miss or I'd have a lot more work to do. And it helps the companies. Amazon says 35% of their revenue comes from their artificial intelligence that suggests what to buy. So it helps me as a consumer, it helps them as a company, and it's not creepy. So even though I start with stuff that like feels a little weird, you can use this in really powerful, good ways. But you need to find a balance and do it in a way that's not going to freak people out. The keys to doing that, in my opinion, are coming down to transparency and consent. So if you're going to use these tools, are you willing to tell people what the tools are that you're using, what those tools do, and how you're using them? And would a reasonable person consent to the data that's being used going in there and for you using the tool in that way? So let me give you an example. There's a tool out there. I have no connection to this company. I just think it's an interesting example. It's called Crystal Knows. And so it's crystal like a glass, knows with a K. Their tagline is they help you write more empathetic email with artificial intelligence. Misses what empathy is a little bit. But basically what you do is you install this. It's a plugin for Google Chrome and Gmail. You start writing an email, you type somebody's address in, and it pops up a little profile of this person. Here's what we know about Jen. Here's the kind of email that would be effective with her. Here's some phrases that you want to use. So for me, it says, keep your email as short as possible, even if it seems impolite. Don't use things like rest assured or we're the most trusted, but say things like, could you take the lead or do this ASAP? That's the kind of advice it gives. And then when you close that, as you start writing your email, when you hit the period at the end of a sentence, it will analyze the sentence. And if you did not follow their suggestions, it highlights it like a spell check error. And if you right click, it rephrases the sentence for you to match what the AI says. Some people find this really creepy. When I talk to people like alumni development officers, the ones who hit you up for money, they are very excited about this tool. Is it a good tool or a bad tool? I don't know, but if you were to use something like this, which is the kind of way this artificial intelligence is often going to come to you, not from you hiring a bunch of data scientists to build it and collect data. It's going to be a third-party tool that just offers you a capability. The questions that you want to ask is, where did you get the data to do this? What are you doing with that data? Did people approve it? And then internally, are we okay with this, and would our customers or our clients be okay with it? Crystal Knows says, we got our data from public sources. That's what they say, public sources. I don't know how they got their data. My mom is in there. I was testing it out. I put my mom's email address. She's in there. My mom is not on any social media. She has an iPhone, and that's it. She has no online accounts. So where did they get that data? We don't know, and they don't tell us. This is really important because if it turns out that they or some other company were getting it in kind of these shady ways that people would be upset about, like the microphone listening in the background being used to build a profile, or it's being bought from someone who's getting it in creepy ways, and your company is using that tool, the public may never have heard of that tool or the company, but they've heard of you. And the story is going to be your company is using data that was taken by listening in on people's phones. So you're really responsible. You're going to take the trust or reputational hit if you're using people who got data in a shady way. So it's your responsibility to do that checking. Where is that data coming from? How did they do their calculations? Are those calculations fair? And are we okay? Do we trust this company to put our reputation in their hands? That's really critical for you maintaining the trust of your clients if you're using these kinds of tools on them. And that kind of leads us into the second question, which is this being done in a fair way? Are these algorithms biased or not? What we see time and time again is that there's a huge amount of bias that creeps in here. I, again, have about 2 hours of material and 6 minutes to talk, so we're not going to go through all of it. But it can be tempting to say, well, it's artificial intelligence. It can't be biased, right? It's just math and data. So how can it be racist or sexist? It's just math. But the way that this technology actually works is that we give an algorithm a bunch of examples of how humans have made decisions before, and the algorithm learns to replicate that. So if there's any bias in what humans have done, it will be in the algorithm as well. And I want to talk through one specific example because it kind of highlights what you can do about this and shows that there are, in fact, solutions. So a study came out recently in Science Magazine that was looking at data from a major nationwide hospital system, millions of patients in this hospital system. And they had a program for patients with lots of complicated disease processes going on. Think they have diabetes, cardiac disease, a whole bunch of things that create a lot of health risks for them. And there's a program that these patients can be referred to that has a whole bunch of specialists and therapists working in it to help manage those conditions. But it's an expensive program, and it's an intensive program, and so you want to refer patients to it when they really need that level of help. And to do that, the hospital system built an algorithm that would analyze the patient records, which they had because it was all internal in their system, and then decide which patients to refer to the program. So these scientists got access to that data, and what they found is that Black patients had to be much sicker than white patients to get referred to the program. So you look at who gets referred, and the Black patients were way sicker than the white patients were. So they dug into this, and the algorithm doesn't even look at race. It's not an input that even goes in there. But what it was doing was predicting quite accurately future healthcare costs. And then if your costs were above a certain threshold, it would refer you to the program. This really shows how tricky this gets, though, because the problem is that white patients are way more expensive than Black patients. They get more surgeries, they see more specialists, and this is because of all kinds of historical, social issues that have to do with race in this country. So because white patients are more expensive, when white patients hit that threshold, they're sick enough to get into the program, but Black patients have to be a lot sicker to get the amount of help that costs the same as white patients, just based on how they see the doctor. If you were to eliminate that bias, the percentage of Black patients who got referred to the program would increase from about 18% to 45%. So there's a huge gap there. And this kind of leads to the first step that you want to think about if you're using these tools, which is auditing. You need to be able to look at them, and even if you can't see the internals or you don't know how they're working, you need to be able to throw a bunch of examples at it and look for the kind of bias that might emerge. And that's especially important in regulated industries. This example shows that there's a straightforward way to do it, that you can look and particularly seek out places where there might be bias and find it. But the reason I really love this story is that the researchers didn't stop there. They said, well, can we get rid of this bias in this algorithm? And what they did was say, okay, well, it's predicting future healthcare costs quite accurately, but it's not predicting how sick you are. It's not predicting health risks. And so they added in a piece. In addition to the healthcare costs, which was working well for the white patients, they added in a calculation of risk of future health problems. Very straightforward to add that in. And when they did that, 85% of the racial bias disappeared from the algorithm. So it was a very straightforward fix, but it required understanding the data, understanding why the problem emerges, and then there's a solution that can be implemented. So I think that's really hopeful, because so many times we can see these examples and we go, oh, it's so broken, like it's so sexist or racist or biased. What are we going to do? We have to throw it out, or do we just not use it? Do we rely on people who are also problematic? But if you understand the domain that you're working in well enough, and you put the time into auditing and understanding, there are actually straightforward solutions that you can have implemented to go with those algorithms that will eliminate the vast majority of those bias problems. So it gets us to a space where you can use these tools that can bring huge benefits to you as a company and to your clients. You can do it in a way that maintains your reputation, that maintains trust, and that's fair to people. And you can skip out on doing all of the stuff that's creepy and will freak people out if they knew you were doing it, just like I freaked you out in the first half of this talk. Maybe you can just do a quick, 1-minute intro of yourselves, and we'll just go across, and then I'll get into the questions.
Hi everyone. My name is Rotimi Ram. I'm co-founder and CEO of Abe.
CJ Brzezinski, I'm the Chief Underwriting Officer for Resilience.
And then Sean Ram. I'm responsible for Insurance at Coalition. I was on the founding team.
Great. So we've got a few different topics that we want to go through today. And I think I want to start with looking at ransomware. So ransomware, it's been a bigger issue, especially since the pandemic, and people are working at home. They're doing all kinds of stuff on their work computers that maybe they weren't doing in the office, or maybe they were, but they have less protection. Is that the biggest risk that we're facing right now? And either way, what are cyber criminals looking at next? What are the other big spaces that we're going to see risk in cyber? Do one of you want to take that first?
Sean, you go first.
Sure, I can take that. So I think it is a significant risk. I think as respects, certainly from an insurance perspective, if you solve ransomware today, you solve cyber risk. It might be helpful to quickly contextualize. We run something called a honeypot network, which we set up about 300 computers for the sole purpose of monitoring what adversaries are doing. And it would be interesting, in March and April of last year, the number of times that adversaries were scanning these 300 computers for remote access related technology was in the billions per week, right? An adversary is rarely walking into a building and installing a USB drive with malware, right? They're doing this from their desk. And the malware that they're deploying through use of home networks or unpatched software, a variety of other vulnerabilities is quite significant. This is interesting from an insurance perspective because historically, a building burns to the ground and adjuster comes and a few weeks later there's adjustment and payment that happens. Well, today a company gets hacked and tomorrow they're asking for $10 million of ransomware. And so actuarially, that's hard, that can be difficult to model. In our business, we've seen ransomware payments increase 3x since the beginning of 2020.
The one thing that I'll add to that is, ransomware is obviously the hot button issue. I know for the brokers that are in the room, that's questions that your insured is dealing with when working with underwriters to try to get that risk transfer policy in place. But there is a lot more behind ransomware. Privacy still continues to be a concern for these insureds that are taking large swaths of data from their clients and their customers and their employees. There's the business interruption piece that goes along with ransomware. That's in addition to that large ransomware payment that gets put out there. So I think it's really just understanding that, as insureds, there's a big picture for you to take a look at and really understanding what your exposure is as an organization. And that's where I think we're really trying to move the conversation when it comes to cyber insurance. It's really having a more holistic view and having insureds understand why it's important that we're asking these questions and why we're trying to educate and share this data back and forth between the insurance carrier or MGA as well as with the broker and with the client.
Yeah, and from my perspective, the thing about ransomware, especially, you have to separate enterprise risks from small businesses. And in small businesses, it's typically the blocking and tackling that they don't do a good enough job with. Most of these attacks are pretty predictable in terms of they use the same types of vulnerabilities in systems. And they typically just hunt for the weakest, the ones that are easiest to find, that have holes in their network that are so big, it's hard to miss. And the problem that SMBs have is that they just don't have the capabilities to stay on top of their security. And but what we found is that the problem with trying to underwrite for this is that you underwrite once in the beginning of the year, and then there's a whole year of changes in cyber risk that you can't account for. And our data shows us that more than 80% of the issues that are going to cause a ransomware happen in the middle of the policy period, but weren't there when you looked at a company at day one. But what we also found is that if you actually interact with the insured throughout the year and you point them to these big issues, they would actually fix it. And we found our insureds to work with us to identify issues throughout the policy period, and we were able to reduce the amount of ransomware in our portfolio by more than 7 times compared to the average in the industry. And so we do think I agree with Sean, ransomware is by far the biggest loss driver in the industry, but we're also seeing that there's a blueprint to actually being able to, not just sub-limit, require co-insurance, increase rates. There's actually a way to help SMBs solve this risk.
And the final piece I'll throw on there to Radham's point is, and I think you'll hear all of us talk about, kind of that education process. The engagement with the insureds has not historically been there when it comes to cyber insurance. It's been just like every other line of business. We have the underwriting process that happens annually. The insured buys their policy and they put it underneath their pillow and they hope that they never have to use it. But understanding that the cyber landscape is constantly changing, there needs to be a better dialogue between the insured and between their insurance provider. And at the end of the day, it's for us trying to help them, trying to make them better, trying to be able to support them as these risks and exposures can constantly change.
Well, let me actually pick up there because that leads into our next question, which is we've seen premiums for cyber insurance skyrocket. Is that because of exactly these issues? Is it a correction? Has it been historically underpriced? Like, what's going on there? And I'll let you start with this.
I'll start. I think that this is where I can lean on my experience of being, at a traditional carrier for the past 15 years. Listen, it's a pendulum that swings both ways. And, before we found ourselves in this period, as an underwriter, you were talking to brokers and understanding that every brokerage was coming out with a new broker form, and there were a number of panels that were being created. Every renewal that was coming across our desks was, how much lower can you take the premium, and how much more coverage can you give me? And that's obviously not the best place of where cyber insurance needs to be, and where we are today with the volatility and not really understanding, what your renewal period is going to look like, or what terms are going to look like, and what capacity is available to you is not where we want to be either. I think where we're going to see some stability, again, is to be able to educate on what it is that we're looking for and the questions and the data segments that we need, and also to be able to create that engagement and that relationship between ourselves as the insurance provider and with the insured themselves, so that they understand that we're in this together. It's a partnership that's never really been looked at like this before, especially when it comes to cyber insurance.
There's insurance is an unusual product where you only know how much it costs you a year after you've priced it. And that works well when the risk is relatively static. So you can actually leverage how it performed in previous years to figure out whether you're going to be making money next year. And one of the things we're seeing is the true uptick in cyber risk happened in early 2020. That's when it actually happened. 2019 was a great year for insurance. 2020, everybody thought it was going to be a great year. But we could already see, as Sean mentioned earlier, we could already see both the frequency and severity of ransomware going up dramatically. And so by the end of 2020, primary carriers were surprised to realize it's not as profitable as we thought. And I think in 2021, with the adjusting in prices, most carriers would probably estimate carefully that I think we're back into having a very robust kind of margin. But the reinsurance carrier partners are not yet there. They don't see the data yet. And so we're kind of entering into 2022 with reinsurance still being relatively very conservative. And at the end of the day, it all goes, it all kind of gets pushed down back to the customer, who is going to not have as much capacity, and it's going to be a lot more expensive. And I think that's somewhat unfortunate, because there are ways with how much data we have today and how fast we can learn that we could speed up these kind of learning processes so we can kind of reduce the volatility. And look, in a major way, we owe it to ourselves to provide confidence to the insurers, because if we're being volatile, then what that tells them is that we don't know what we're doing. And I think that it's a bit of a self-inflicted issue.
And Sean, I want your thoughts on this, but also to just pick up on that. Does this mean that some people are just going to go without cyber insurance, and are there extra risks that come with that? So if you have thoughts on that, throw it in, but I'd like your thoughts overall.
Yeah, please. Happy to do that. So various entities in the intelligence community recognize a methodology that adversaries use to infiltrate networks, and they refer to that as a kill chain, right? And the first step of the kill chain is reconnaissance, right? Like if I'm a burglar, I walk into a building and I don't steal something, I just sit there and watch. I just look around. And I figure out where the safes are. I figure out how often people come in, where I need to hide, where I should stay, and I plan an attack for the future. I believe, to your question, original question, there was a correction that was needed. I think it's a misnomer to believe that all of the ransomware attacks that occurred in 2020 were burglars that walked in 2020, if you will, right? There were many adversaries that had implemented, I'll call them kill switches, right, years prior, then that just sat dormant, and they found this pandemic and this unique environment, and they said, now's the time, let's exploit. Now, there are methodologies to see those kill switches from years prior, right? But the underwriting community weren't perhaps as sophisticated, and maybe didn't understand it as strongly. And so when all the exploitation happened in 2020, certainly it had a significant impact on reinsurance pricing. Now, to your point, and Rotem kind of highlighted this, as the coverage decreases in value, most notably around ransomware, the most prominent topic, right? If I'm an entity today and I want to buy cyber insurance, it's like buying a property policy that doesn't cover fire. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? And so I'm either going to make a decision that I'm going to find an entity that will cover me for my greatest concern, or I'm going to look for additional services, value-added services, risk management services that will help enhance the product in order for me to purchase. However, I will state that I think this is the most exciting time in the cybersecurity and insurance industry in relation to digital risks. And I think more companies are purchasing cyber insurance than ever before. I had a client who happens to be a friend of mine have a ransomware attack. He called me a couple weeks afterwards and he said, I had no idea the insurance industry provided this much value to this problem. He's like, I didn't know what to do. I don't hold Bitcoin. I don't know how to negotiate. I don't know the lawyers. I don't know what to do. And the insurance industry stepped in this case us, but any carrier would operate in this way, stepped in and just solved that problem for them. So I think the value of insurance needs to continue to increase around what I believe is the most pervasive risk of society today.
So we know one of the best ways to manage this is to have good risk management strategies, and you all are working on that in different perspectives. So what would you say are some essential risk management tools or techniques or strategies that companies should be looking at in the cyberspace? And you can go ahead and go first if you want.
Sure. So there's, and again, the answer to this question really changes when you think about different sizes of organizations. JP Morgan or Citibank have 500 people on their security team and hundreds of millions of dollars in budgets. And they are also up against a very different class of adversaries that are very sophisticated and take a very long view at this problem, where small businesses do not have the resources or the staff, but are also facing a very different and a much more opportunistic type of attacker who is not necessarily specifically looking for them, but is rather searching for the easiest prey that they could go after. For those small and medium-sized businesses, and it's pretty remarkable how big you can get and still be considered a small business. But for those businesses, I would say blocking and tackling. We all have a technology stack. We are buying technology from technology vendors to power our business. It's the same as buying a car so that you can get to work. You enjoy the benefit of the car. You're not really interested in maintaining that car. And imagine that you go into your car, let's say it's a Toyota, and your brakes fail. You survive the crash only to learn that Toyota posted on their blog post a post about a critical vulnerability in their brake system, and they're not going to tell you about it. They're not going to recall the car. They're not going to fix the damage. And if you have any injury, they're not going to be liable to any of it because their terms and conditions were such that they don't have to do anything about it. Now imagine you have 500 different vendors in your car. And that's basically what we're doing with cybersecurity. And when you're a small business, all you want to do is buy a car to get to work. But now you need to have full-time employees figuring out how to keep all your systems in check so that you don't become this easy prey. And so just figuring out that blocking and tackling. And to Sean's points earlier, the insurance can come in because we're sharing the risk. In some cases, we'll take most of the burden of the risk. So we have an incentive to actually help them with these things, especially when we can deliver technology at scale that doesn't require just kind of manually handling kind of all their stuff. But beyond that, I would say definitely backups is huge, especially in ransomware, and a bunch of other technical measures. We don't have to get into them, but having a good, sophisticated, endpoint solution, an EDR, having the same thing on your email environment. Email is by far the most predominant attack vector, so getting your email security straight is key, and you should be able to get good answers from your insurance company on how you should go about doing those things.
Yeah, I'll say the low-hanging fruit there also is employee awareness training. As Rada mentioned, with the number of ransomware attacks that happen through email, clicking on that phishing link is the easiest way for this ransomware to be deployed within an organization and for the havoc to start. So being able to have a strong employee awareness training program in place to test your employees when it comes to phishing attacks and making sure they don't click on those links is a good place to start. And then always, redundancy and having resilience with, the operational controls that you have in place. With backing up your data and making sure that it's stored off-site, having that data being encrypted, making sure that you're operationally redundant as an organization is definitely key to making sure you can survive a ransomware attack.
Sean?
most of it's been mentioned. The only thing I would mention, and similar to your comments earlier about security questions and passwords and things of that nature, is just implement two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication on your email and critical business systems. I received an email this week that I was caught in the LinkedIn breach. It's not that big of a deal to me because I don't have the same password on LinkedIn than anywhere else. I enabled 2FA, so if an adversary has my LinkedIn password, they're not going to use it anywhere else because I don't use it anywhere else. So some of those simple things solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on that as someone who's battled a lot with implementations of two-factor authentication in my own organizations, that finding one that's as easy as possible for people to use is going to increase your compliance and then increase your security so much. Ours used to be terrible, and now it literally just pings a thing on my phone and it's in, and that makes everybody happier to use it. All right, we have 3 minutes left. We have 3 of you, but the time's counting down. So you get less than a minute to give me your top answer to what do we see as regulation forthcoming in this space? What do you think are cyber, say at the federal level, cyber regulations that are coming? You got about 45 seconds each, and Sean, we'll start with you and come back this way.
We spent a lot of time with the U.S. government recently, including a visit to the White House. The U.S. government in particular is very concerned with ransomware, issued updated content regulation around paying ransomware to OFAC-related companies, including labeling a particular cryptocurrency exchange as now sanctioned by the government. I think there's a lot of opportunity. We do believe that ransomware payments should not be prohibited by the US government. They're already in your network. You've already been hacked. And the insurance industry, more than anyone, recognizes the impact of business interruption. If I can't pay, or if I don't have the ability to pay ransom and they have my entire network hostage, well, that's going to cause me a lot more pain in the long term.
CJ.
So, we are fortunate enough as Resilience to be part of those White House discussions as well. What I'm excited to see is that we're actually having a seat at the table. To be sitting around and talking to the administration with, leaders within the tech industry and the security industry, and to have insurance folks there too is key to hearing our side of the story and what we think could be good going forward. The biggest thing that I'd like to see coming out of those conversations is the insurance ISAC, right? Why is it that all these other these other industries have their own information sharing committees and nothing yet has been set up on the insurance side? It's important for us to share what it is that we're learning on a day-to-day basis and sharing it with others out there so that information can be passed down to insureds as well as to brokers so that they can continue to educate that message.
You get the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Sharing's great. I think we should lead. I think on this ceiling, there's probably a sprinkler system, and it's not because this hotel is passionate about sprinkler technology or the brand of the specific system. I think the insurance company told them that that's the only way they can get to insure this place, and it's because the insurance understands how they lose money. And that's where we can create a message that is incredibly easy for everyone, including all the folks in Washington, to understand what actually drives the impact. And we have a policy that can show whether we can put our money where our mouth is in terms of the recommendations that we have in terms of policy coverage and premiums. So would we accept a car manufacturer that had a sharp object inside the car or came with no seatbelt? I might be a bit on the extreme side, but I do not think that business email software should be legal if it doesn't have MFA by default. I don't think this should be a choice. We don't allow businesses and users to make choices where we understand that the risk is very high. And I think that today, software vendors, they're not being evil. They're solving for functionality. They're solving for delighting their users. They are also delighting attackers on accident. They're making it very easy to go in. And it's easy to push all of the liability and all of the need back on the customer through education and shaming them on media when they get breached. But honestly, these very few large software vendors, if they enforced tools and measures that made their products less convenient, but I have young daughters, they do not like to put their seatbelt, but they also don't have an option because there's a grown-up, and that's the role the government needs to play here.
Awesome, thank you. So we have time for Q&A, just like I did it a few minutes ago. There's 2 microphones that you can come up to, and you can talk to our panel.
We talked about in 19 is, or 18 is when they were sitting in the lobby watching where the safes were. And I love that kind of visual. I often think about everything that's out there for me, and I'll change a lot of things now that I know, but I'm worried about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and what they already have on them. Can you speak to, be futuristic for a moment, as opposed to how does this affect me? How does this affect the next and the next generation? Thank you.
I'll start. I'll say, hopefully, it makes things safer for them, right? I mean, we are having that conversation now, and understanding where there currently are holes in the way that we are doing things from a business perspective, from a data perspective on the internet, and hopefully having these conversations, being able to have a seat at the table, within the government and helping shape some of the future policy and regulation is going to make the world a safer place for the grandchildren and for future generations as well.
Yeah, I can add, look, I think we built the internet in a very naive way. We didn't understand what it was about to do. And when you give something for free and then you add, if you give $1 for free and then 10 years later you ask for 10 cents back, it's really hard to give it back. I think there's a lot of, I think we're also seeing conflicting, even just, a free internet makes it hard to have a secure internet. But that is a value that we have, and I think that there's a reckoning, I think, coming, and it's going to be really painful. But I think that afterwards, our children and grandchildren are going to grow into a natively digital world, and money is changing, and how we interact is changing, and I think there's going to have to be a major change, and I don't see it happening without a lot of friction. But
to use email as an example, most of us started using email and never had a secondary method of authentication. It was completely foreign. And maybe when we started to have to put the code in or look at our phone, oh, this is such a pain, right? I think our grandkids will not grow up in that environment. I think they'll grow up in an environment where it will be required, and that knowledge around MFA will just be widely recognized, similar to the seatbelt example. However, the adversary only has to be right once, right? The defense has to be right 100% of the time, thousands and thousands of attack. And so the need for an evolutionary underwriting process, risk mitigation over time, because let's just look at a 10-year period in cyber, okay? 10 years ago, CJ mentioned this, the topic of the day of cyber was data breach. We talked about Target, right, or Home Depot, or whatever it might be, and the entire insurance industry was focused on data breach. Well, 5 years ago, the topic was social engineering, like funds transfer fraud. And within this short period of time, now it's ransomware. Those other topics are still there, but there aren't many products in the insurance industry within a 10-year period. The threat vector associated with claims are so prolifically different. It's fascinating, right? And so the need to update models, I mean, when we think about the admitted process in the United States and filings, it doesn't make sense in cyber. That's really a challenging environment to have dynamic pricing, rating methodologies. And so we have to be able to adapt, right, as adversaries do.
Yeah, you done? Great. Okay, let's let him go. Oh, I'm sorry. I look over, I was like, I didn't think she was wearing red before. Sorry, I'm going to go to this side first, though. Thanks.
I'll do a quick question. Can you talk about how using decentralized blockchain technology offensively for businesses to actually secure their information, rather than using it and treating it as a critical infrastructure point for paying ransomware? Thank you.
I'm glad you guys have these questions. I always dread the blockchain questions that I get half the time. Any of you want to jump in on it?
I can take a crack. I think there's tremendous opportunity in the insurance industry. CJ mentioned the notion of sharing, and when you have distributed ledgers with inordinate amounts of data that are being shared in public networks, we have to have a better, I guess, openness to use of blockchain within our industry. The notion of insurance certificates makes little sense to me in the manner in which we go about that as an industry. Like, we know we covered this company. The company knows we covered the company. If someone else wants validation, that should be easily available. Simple, straightforward, right? So I think there's tremendous opportunities there. I think the use of technology in the insurance industry is improving slowly. my panelists, like we built companies that were founded on a technology-first strategy that leverages insurance. So I think we'll see accelerated use of blockchain in the future.
My only comment there is you're seeing definitely a shift from being defensive to offensive, right? And historically, it's always been how do we react to the latest incident that's happening, or the way to protect our data. And I think going on the offensive is trying to seek out these things like blockchain. Really going after some of the security providers that are out there that are creating these apps and making sure that they install those security things on the front end, right? So really being on the offensive to really push and drive the change that's necessary to make insured safer and at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit more skeptic on blockchain for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's as an infrastructure. I mean, I very much like it theoretically. Practically, it is very young, and to be able to actually put critical business processes at scale on top of blockchain right now is not really kind of a reality. And I don't really see the need to, with blockchain, you take away the sensor or the centralized. I don't see centralization being that much of an issue, but I do think there are exciting developments in terms of organizations being able to break down the monolith a little bit in terms of how their network looks like, so that it makes it a lot harder, leveraging the cloud. Everything used to be centralized I'm old enough to remember that when I was in the military, everything had to go back to a central system. Then it all went to your endpoint, and now it's all back to the cloud. I think there's exciting stuff there, but I don't think blockchain is going to be the way it actually happens.
I'll just lend you some support and say I share your skepticism of blockchain. But I'm sorry, go ahead. You get the last question. We got a couple minutes left.
Okay, thank you. We just went through our own cyber renewal for our company. We got half the amount of coverage, twice the price, hadn't had any incidents. When you talk about ransomware and paying ransomware, you're dealing with crooks. How do you trust them that they're even going to give you back your data? So speak for a few moments about the balance of payment, how the insurance industry typically responds when you have a loss. Guess what happens? Your rates go up, you get less coverage. So how do we address this risk most appropriately?
We've got about 2 minutes left, so quick answers.
The quick answer for the first piece is honor amongst thieves, right? I mean, if they're not going to be trusted to either return the key to you to unlock your data in return for that payment, it's really going to make their whole entire system kind of fall apart. So to that piece, it is frustrating, but from the experiences that we've had, it's the best customer service experience that you're ever going to receive when there's an accident, right? They have 1-800 numbers. They have call centers. They will do everything that they can to help you facilitate that payment, because that's what drives them. They are a business, and they want to make sure that they deliver on that for you. Yeah. And then from the perspective of just kind of looking at your insurance renewals, it's really. Prices are going up even though companies have not had claims. However, a lot of that is just being driven by what the overall security posture looks like in these organizations. And I think that that's where we're going to see a lot less volatility. Again, when the education of brokers understanding what it is that carriers are going to look for and MGAs are going to look for from a data perspective and a need perspective from a security controls, and then being able to help educate with that conversation to you all and to your clients, so that we can become comfortable that you're doing the right things and that you have the proper plan in place to implement the controls that we want to see later on in the day, and to be able to work with you on those type of things.
Okay, I'm going to claim. Oh, you want to do it in the last 30 seconds?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think in three steps. Number one, can we take away 85% of the ransomware claims like we've been doing? That's number one. So let's not have a claim. If there is a claim, let's figure out, is there a way to get you back up to speed without having to engage a criminal? And if you do have to, there are people who have been doing this for kind of hundreds of times, as CJ said. It actually works pretty well. We all kind of hate doing it, but I think it's even worse if the insured ends up with a broken organization, inability to go back to doing business. So we do what's best for the insured at that point in time.
Well summarized. And with that, we are out of time. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion.